Sarah Martinez had always been careful about her tattoos. The intricate designs that covered her arms told stories that most people weren't ready to hear. After 3 tours in Afghanistan, she had learned to keep them hidden beneath long sleeves, even in the sweltering heat of Phoenix summers. But today, something felt different as she walked into the upscale law firm of Henderson and Associates for what should have been a routine job interview. The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly manicured nails and a practiced smile, looked her up and down with barely concealed judgment. Sarah's credentials were impeccable: a law degree from Arizona State University, topped with military honors and experience in military justice. She had every qualification they were looking for in their veteran outreach program, yet she could feel the weight of assumptions pressing down on her shoulders like desert heat. "Miss Martinez?" The voice belonged to Patricia Henderson, the firm's founding partner. She was a woman in her 50s, dressed in an expensive suit that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. Her handshake was firm, but her eyes were calculating, already forming opinions before they had even spoken. The conference room was intimidating in its sterility. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of downtown Phoenix, while the mahogany table reflected the faces of 5 partners who would decide her fate. Sarah recognized the type immediately: successful, privileged individuals who had never known the weight of combat boots or the sound of incoming mortar fire. "We're very interested in your background," began James Morrison, a partner who looked like he had stepped out of a country club magazine. "Your military service is certainly unique for someone applying to our corporate law division." Sarah kept her expression neutral, though she could sense the underlying tone. These people saw her military service as an oddity, perhaps even a liability in their world of corporate mergers and high-stakes negotiations. She had encountered this attitude before, the subtle suggestion that soldiers were somehow less suited for civilized professions. "I believe my military experience brings a unique perspective to problem-solving and client relations," she responded diplomatically. "Leadership under pressure and attention to detail are skills that translate well to legal practice." The questions that followed were predictable. They probed her ability to handle stress, her commitment to civilian life, and whether she had any adjustment issues from her time in the service. Each question felt like a small cut, designed to make her prove she belonged in their world. Then came the moment that would change everything. "Miss Martinez." Patricia Henderson leaned forward, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "We've noticed you're wearing long sleeves on a particularly warm day. Our firm has certain standards regarding professional appearance. We need to ensure that our attorneys present themselves appropriately to our high-profile clients." Sarah felt her jaw tighten. She knew exactly where this was heading. The request was coming, the same request that had derailed 3 previous interviews at other firms. The assumption that a female veteran must be hiding something unsavory beneath her clothing. "I'm not sure I understand what you're implying," Sarah said carefully, though she understood perfectly. "Well," James Morrison interjected with false casualness, "many veterans have tattoos that might not be suitable for our corporate environment. We just want to ensure there won't be any complications with client meetings or court appearances." The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. Sarah could feel the eyes of all 5 partners on her, waiting for her response. This was the moment she had dreaded and prepared for in equal measure. They wanted to see what she was hiding, to judge her worthiness based on the ink that decorated her skin. "You want me to roll up my sleeves," she stated flatly. "It's just a formality," Patricia assured her, though her tone suggested it was anything but. "We need to see what we're working with." Sarah's mind raced back to the last time someone had made this demand. It had been at a prestigious firm in Scottsdale, where the senior partner had taken one look at her tattoos and immediately ended the interview. The memory still stung, not because of the rejection, but because of the way he had looked at her, as if she were some kind of exotic animal in a zoo. But this time felt different. Maybe it was the condescending tone in Patricia Henderson's voice, or perhaps it was the way James Morrison had leaned back in his chair with a smug expression, as if he had already decided her fate. Something inside Sarah snapped, not into anger, but into a quiet resolve. "Fine," she said, reaching for the cuffs of her blazer. "But I want you to understand something first. These tattoos represent the most important period of my life. They're not decorations or youthful mistakes. They're memorials." Her fingers worked slowly at the buttons, giving the partners time to absorb her words. She could see them exchange glances, perhaps expecting to find crude military slogans or pin-up girls. Their ignorance about military culture was about to be shattered in the most profound way possible. Each piece was carefully designed and placed. Sarah continued as she rolled up her right sleeve. They tell the story of people who didn't make it home, and the promises I made to remember them. The first tattoo to be revealed was a delicate compass rose on her wrist, with coordinates inscribed below it. The numbers meant nothing to the lawyers, but to Sarah, they marked the exact location where her unit had been ambushed during her second tour. It was where she had held Private Danny Chen as he died, whispering messages for his family back in San Francisco. As more of her forearm was revealed, the partners could see intricate military insignia interwoven with names and dates. These weren't random decorations, but carefully crafted memorials that spoke to loss, brotherhood, and sacrifice. The quality of the artwork was exceptional, each element designed to honor specific individuals and moments. James Morrison's smug expression began to falter as he realized this wasn't what he had expected. The tattoos were sophisticated, meaningful, and beautifully executed. They spoke to a level of experience and loss that none of the partners could comprehend. Sarah began rolling up her left sleeve, revealing more of the story. A tactical unit patch was surrounded by poppies, the flowers that had grown wild around their forward operating base in Helmand Province. Beneath it, in elegant script, were the words "Until Valhalla," followed by a list of names that seemed to go on forever. The conference room had grown uncomfortably quiet. Patricia Henderson's professional mask was beginning to slip, replaced by something that might have been recognition or even respect. She had 2 sons of military age, and for the first time she was confronting the reality of what service actually meant. But Sarah wasn't finished. As she continued to reveal her arms, the true scope of her story began to emerge. These weren't just tattoos. They were a living memorial to an entire platoon that had been lost in one devastating attack. The partners were looking at something they had never encountered before. A survivor's tribute to the fallen. "This is Sergeant Williams," Sarah said, pointing to a detailed portrait rendered in stunning black and gray. "He was our squad leader. Saved my life twice before I lost him to an IED outside Kandahar. He had 3 kids back home who will never see their father again." The weight of her words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. These weren't the crude tattoos they had imagined. They were witnessing art that spoke to profound loss and unimaginable sacrifice. Each element had meaning, each design choice was deliberate, and every line spoke to experiences that none of them could begin to understand. Sarah could see the change in their expressions, but she wasn't done yet. She had started this revelation, and she was going to finish it. They wanted to see what she was hiding beneath her sleeves, and now they were going to get the full story. Her right arm was almost completely exposed now, revealing a sleeve that was more like a tapestry than a collection of individual tattoos. Military ribbons and medals were interwoven with symbols of faith, hope, and remembrance. A pair of combat boots hung from crossed rifles, with dog tags bearing names and serial numbers of soldiers who would never answer another roll call. But it was her left arm that would truly silence them. As she rolled up the final portion of her sleeve, the centerpiece of her memorial was revealed in all its terrible beauty. The image that would haunt the partners long after this interview was over and would force them to confront their own assumptions about veterans and the prices they pay for freedom. The room held its breath as the final tattoo came into view, and Sarah prepared to tell them about Cerberus, the 3-headed guardian of the underworld, and the symbol her fallen platoon had chosen to represent their unbreakable bond. The silence in the conference room was deafening as the full scope of Sarah's left arm was revealed. There, dominating her forearm in magnificent detail, was Cerberus, the mythological 3-headed dog that guarded the gates of the underworld. But this wasn't some generic interpretation from a tattoo parlor flashbook. This was a masterpiece of memorial art that told a story of brotherhood, sacrifice, and the thin line between life and death. The 3 heads of Cerberus were rendered with stunning realism, each representing a different member of her platoon's leadership triangle. The center head bore the face of Lieutenant Marcus Thompson, her platoon leader whose tactical brilliance had kept them alive through countless operations until that final devastating mission. To the left was Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the platoon sergeant whose steady leadership and dark humor had held the unit together through 18 months of deployment. The right head depicted Corporal Jackson, the youngest of the 3, whose technical expertise with communications equipment had saved them more times than anyone could count. Beneath the magnificent beast, in flowing script, were the words that had become their unit's unofficial motto, Guardian Angels of the Fallen. Around the base of the tattoo, 23 names were inscribed in perfect calligraphy. Every member of 3rd Platoon, Bravo Company, who had died in the ambush that Sarah had somehow survived. Patricia Henderson found herself leaning forward despite her professional composure. The artwork was extraordinary, but more than that, it radiated a sense of profound loss and eternal vigilance that she had never encountered.
This wasn't body art, this was a shrine. My God, whispered Dr.
Elizabeth Warren, the firm's newest partner who had remained silent throughout the interview. Her voice carried a weight that suggested she might understand more than her colleagues about the significance of what they were seeing. Sarah's voice remained steady as she began to explain, though her eyes held depths of sorrow that no amount of professional success could ever fill. 3rd Platoon was assigned to provide security for a convoy delivering medical supplies to a remote village outside Sangin. It should have been routine. We had run similar missions dozens of times. But intelligence had failed us. The Taliban had been planning this ambush for weeks. The partners listened with growing horror as Sarah painted the picture of that day. How their Humvee had been the third in a convoy of 5 vehicles. How the IED had taken out the lead vehicle, while RPGs had disabled the rear 2 simultaneously. How her platoon had found themselves trapped in a killing field with nowhere to run and no reinforcements close enough to matter. Lieutenant Thompson made the decision to hold our position and create a defensive perimeter around the wounded, Sarah continued, her fingers unconsciously tracing the outline of Cerberus on her arm. He knew that if we broke and ran, the wounded would die, so we stayed and fought. James Morrison, who had been so eager to see what she was hiding beneath her sleeves, now found himself unable to look away from the memorial before him. The 3 heads of Cerberus seemed to watch him with ancient wisdom, judging his worthiness to hear this sacred story. Sarah's narrative continued with the precision of someone who had told this story to countless therapists, military investigators, and survivor support groups. How they had fought for 7 hours against overwhelming odds. How, one by one, her brothers had fallen defending their wounded comrades. How Lieutenant Thompson had used his body to shield a medic who was treating 3 critically injured soldiers, taking the sniper's bullet that had been meant for the medical personnel.
Rodriguez went next, she said, her voice growing quieter but never losing its strength.
He was coordinating our ammunition distribution when a mortar round landed 10 meters from his position. The shrapnel. She paused, not because the memory was too painful to continue, but because she could see the effect her words were having on her audience. The conference room had transformed into something resembling a confessional. These successful attorneys, who spent their days dealing with corporate mergers and contract disputes, were confronting a reality that existed far beyond their comfortable world of billable hours and partnership meetings. They were hearing about young Americans who had died in service to their country, told by one of the few who had lived to remember them. Patricia Henderson found herself thinking about her own sons, safe in their Ivy League universities, pursuing careers that would never require them to make life-or-death decisions before their 21st birthdays. The contrast was stark and uncomfortable. Corporal Jackson held the radio position until the very end, Sarah continued. Even when the Taliban overran our perimeter, he kept calling for evacuation flights for the wounded. His last transmission was coordinates for the medevac helicopter that finally arrived 3 hours too late for most of my platoon. Dr. Warren, who had remained largely silent throughout the interview, finally spoke up. Her voice was barely above a whisper. How did you survive? Sarah's expression grew even more solemn as she prepared to tell the part of the story that haunted her most. I was thrown clear by the same explosion that killed Rodriguez. Spent 6 hours playing dead under his body while the Taliban searched for survivors. The helicopter crew found me when they came to collect the bodies. The weight of survivors' guilt hung heavy in the air. Here was a woman who had lived through hell, who carried the memory of 23 fallen comrades on her skin, and who had somehow found the strength to build a new life in the civilian world. Yet these people had questioned whether her tattoos were appropriate for their corporate environment. Sarah began to roll her sleeves back down, but Patricia Henderson held up a hand. "Wait," she said, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been reverence. "There's more, isn't there?" To the tattoo, I mean. Sarah nodded slowly. She lifted her left arm slightly, revealing additional elements of the design that had been hidden by her position. Extending from beneath Cerberus were wings, not the stereotypical angel wings found in most memorial tattoos, but the detailed, realistic wings of a helicopter. The wings wrapped around her arm, creating the impression that Cerberus was in flight, carrying the souls of the fallen to their final rest. The medevac helicopter, Sarah explained. Pilot's name was Captain Sarah Mitchell, same first name as mine. She flew into that kill zone knowing she might not make it out, but she came for us anyway. She's the reason I'm here today and the reason some of the wounded made it home. Woven into the helicopter wings were subtle details that spoke to the chaos and horror of that day. Bullet holes were represented by tiny stars, each one marking a hit the aircraft had taken during the rescue operation. Small poppies, Afghanistan's ubiquitous flowers, were scattered throughout the design, their red centers like drops of blood against the black and gray artwork. But it was the final element of the tattoo that truly captured the partner's attention. At the very top of the design, barely visible above the collar of Sarah's shirt, was a small banner bearing a single word, Eternum, forever. It's Latin, Sarah explained, though she suspected at least some of them would know. It means eternal. My promise to them that they will never be forgotten, that their sacrifice meant something, and that someone will always remember their names. The silence that followed was profound. These 5 successful attorneys who prided themselves on their ability to argue any position and question any assumption found themselves completely without words. They had expected to find crude military tattoos that might embarrass their firm in front of important clients. Instead, they had discovered a work of art that spoke to sacrifice, honor, and loss on a scale they could barely comprehend. Dr. Elizabeth Warren was the first to break the silence, her voice heavy with emotion. My brother was killed in Iraq in 2007. Marines. I've seen a lot of military memorial tattoos, but nothing like this. Nothing that told a story this complete. Sarah looked at her with recognition, the look that passed between people who had been touched by combat loss. What was his name? A cesse on the tips of 2 Severan cities. Recess essay on the tips of Michael Warren, Semper Fi. To him and to you. The exchange revealed something that the other partners had missed in their rush to judgment. Military families understood the weight of these memorials in ways that civilians never could. Warren's reaction to Sarah's tattoo wasn't shock or disapproval. It was recognition of a sacred trust, a promise kept, and a story that deserved to be honored rather than hidden. James Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly struggling with the revelation that his preconceptions had been so completely wrong. The crude military tattoos he had imagined bore no resemblance to the sophisticated memorial artwork covering Sarah's arms. More than that, he was beginning to realize that he had made assumptions about her character based on ignorance rather than understanding. Patricia Henderson found herself in the difficult position of recognizing that her firm's policies regarding tattoos might need serious reconsideration. How could they ask someone to hide memorial artwork that honored fallen heroes? What message did that send about their respect for military service and sacrifice? But the interview wasn't over yet. Sarah had revealed the story of Cerberus and the fallen Platoon, but there was still the matter of her qualifications, her fitness for the position, and whether Henderson and Associates was worthy of her service. The power dynamic in the room had shifted fundamentally, and everyone present could feel it. The question was no longer whether Sarah's tattoos were appropriate for their firm. The question had become whether their firm was worthy of someone who had paid such a price for the freedoms they enjoyed, and who carried the memory of heroes on her very skin. The transformation in the conference room was palpable. What had begun as a standard job interview had evolved into something far more profound, a moment of education, reflection, and perhaps even shame for the partners of Henderson and Associates. Sarah Martinez stood before them, her memorial sleeves now fully revealed, carrying the weight of 23 fallen comrades and the story of a survivor who had rebuilt her life from the ashes of unimaginable loss. Dr. Elizabeth Warren broke the heavy silence that had settled over the room. Sarah, may I ask you something personal? When Sarah nodded, she continued, how do you carry that weight every day? How do you function knowing that you survived when so many others didn't? The question hung in the air like incense in a cathedral. Sarah had been asked this question many times before, by therapists, by fellow veterans, by family members who struggled to understand how someone could rebuild their life after experiencing such trauma. But something about Dr. Rabana, Warren's tone, informed by her own loss, made the question feel different. "The tattoos help," Sarah said simply. "Every morning when I get dressed, I see their faces, their names, their symbols. It reminds me that I'm not living just for myself anymore. I'm living for them too. Every achievement, every success, every moment of happiness, it's all dedicated to their memory." Patricia Henderson found herself studying Sarah with new eyes. This wasn't the potentially problematic hire she had imagined when the interview began. This was a woman who had been forged in fire and emerged stronger, carrying with her a sense of purpose that most people never developed. The question of whether her tattoos were appropriate for corporate clients suddenly seemed not just irrelevant, but insulting. "Tell us about your legal work," Patricia said, attempting to steer the conversation back toward professional qualifications. But even as she asked, she realized that everything about Sarah's background was interconnected. Her military experience, her survival, her memorial tattoos, her legal education, they were all part of the same story of resilience and dedication. Sarah straightened slightly, transitioning back into professional mode while still carrying the solemnity of her revelations. "I specialized in military justice during my service, which led to my interest in veterans' rights law after my discharge. I've spent the last 3 years working with legal aid organizations, helping veterans navigate disability claims, housing disputes, and employment discrimination cases." James Morrison leaned forward, his earlier condescension replaced by genuine interest. "Employment discrimination? You mean cases like this one?" The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Here was a woman who specialized in fighting employment discrimination against veterans, being interviewed by a firm that had just demanded she reveal her memorial tattoos to determine her suitability for hire. "Exactly like this one," Sarah confirmed with a slight smile that carried no humor. "I've represented dozens of veterans who were denied employment or fired because employers found their tattoos, their service records, or their disabilities inconvenient for corporate images." The silence that followed was uncomfortable but necessary. Each partner was privately examining their own biases and assumptions. They had all supported veterans in abstract ways, attending charity galas, writing checks to military nonprofits, posting patriotic messages on social media. But when faced with a real veteran carrying visible reminders of her service, their first instinct had been to judge and potentially exclude. "Dr. Tichy." Warren spoke again, her voice carrying the weight of personal experience. "What's the most difficult case you've handled?" Sarah's expression grew thoughtful. "A Marine veteran named David Hutchins. He lost his leg in Afghanistan and had a prosthetic. Also had a memorial tattoo on his neck for his squad leader, who died in the same IED attack that injured him. He was a brilliant accountant, CPA, excellent references, but he couldn't get hired anywhere because employers said his tattoo was unprofessional and his prosthetic made clients uncomfortable." The partners exchanged glances. The parallels to their own behavior were becoming impossible to ignore. "What happened to him?" Patricia asked, though she seemed to dread the answer. "We won his case against 3 different firms, substantial settlements, but the damage was done. David had been unemployed for 2 years, lost his apartment, his confidence, his sense of purpose. The money helped, but it couldn't give him back those years of rejection and humiliation." The message was clear without being explicitly stated. Sarah was giving them a preview of what could happen if they chose to discriminate against her based on her memorial tattoos. But more than that, she was showing them the human cost of corporate policies that failed to understand or respect military service. Patricia Henderson found herself in the uncomfortable position of realizing that her firm's employee handbook might be legally problematic. Their policies regarding visible tattoos had seemed reasonable when applied to typical body art, but they had never considered the implications for military memorial tattoos. The legal exposure alone was concerning, but the moral implications were even more troubling. "Sarah," Patricia said carefully, "I want to apologize. Our request to see your tattoos was inappropriate. We should have focused solely on your qualifications and experience." Sarah nodded graciously, but didn't let them off the hook entirely. "I appreciate that, Miss Henderson. But I need you to understand something. This isn't the first time I've been asked to roll up my sleeves for an interview. It's become so common that I've started to expect it. Veterans with visible tattoos face this discrimination regularly. Dr. Warren leaned back in her chair, processing the full scope of what Sarah was telling them. How many interviews have you had where this happened? This is my 7th interview in 6 months. 4 of them ended immediately after they saw my tattoos. 2 others led to job offers that were rescinded after further consideration. You're the first firm that's actually listened to the story behind them. The weight of systemic discrimination was becoming clear. This wasn't isolated behavior by Henderson and Associates. It was part of a pattern that veterans faced across the professional landscape. Companies that claimed to support the troops were simultaneously rejecting the very people who had served. James Morrison, who had been quiet since his earlier misstep, finally found his voice. What do you need from us? I mean, if we were to offer you a position, what accommodations or considerations would you require? Sarah appreciated the direct question. I don't need accommodations for my tattoos. They're part of who I am. What I need is an employer who understands that these aren't decorations or personal choices. They're memorials to fallen heroes, and they deserve respect, not concealment. The conversation had shifted from whether Sarah was suitable for their firm to whether their firm was suitable for her. The partners were beginning to realize that hiring her wouldn't just add a qualified attorney to their roster. It would require them to examine and potentially change their organizational culture. What about client reactions? Patricia asked. I'm not defending the concern, but realistically, some of our clients might have outdated views about tattoos. Sarah had heard this objection many times before. In my experience, clients care about competence, not appearance. But more importantly, any client who would reject legal representation because their attorney honors fallen soldiers probably isn't someone you want to represent anyway. Those clients reveal more about their character than my tattoos reveal about mine. The truth of that statement landed heavily in the room. Henderson and Associates prided itself on selective client relationships, choosing to work only with companies that shared their values. Yet they had never considered that their appearance policies might attract clients whose values they should reject. Dr. Warren made a decision that would change the trajectory of the conversation. Sarah, I want to share something with you. My brother Michael's memorial tattoo covers my entire back. It's a battlefield cross with his dog tags surrounded by the names of his entire squad. I've kept it hidden for years because I was afraid it would hurt my career. The revelation stunned the other partners. Dr. Warren had worked with them for 3 years, and none of them had known about her tattoo. The secrecy she had maintained highlighted the very problem they were discussing. That's exactly the point, Sarah said gently. We're forcing people to hide memorials to heroes. We're making them choose between honoring their fallen comrades and advancing their careers. That's not just discrimination, it's a betrayal of the values we claim to support. The room fell silent again as the full implications of their policies became clear. They weren't just potentially losing talented employees, they were perpetuating a system that forced veterans to choose between professional success and personal honor. Patricia Henderson looked around the table at her partners, seeing the same realization in their eyes. This interview had become a turning point not just for Sarah's career prospects, but for the fundamental culture of their firm. They could continue with business as usual, maintaining policies that excluded veterans like Sarah, or they could choose to evolve. But the decision wasn't just about policy changes. It was about whether they had the courage to confront their own biases and become the kind of organization that truly honored service rather than just paying it lip service. The question was whether Henderson and Associates was ready to be worthy of someone who carried the memory of heroes on her skin. The afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Henderson and Associates conference room, casting long shadows across the mahogany table where 5 partners sat in contemplative silence. Sarah Martinez remained standing, her memorial sleeve still visible, carrying the weight of revelation that had transformed a routine job interview into a moment of institutional reckoning. Patricia Henderson was the first to break the silence, her voice carrying a gravity that hadn't been present at the beginning of the interview. Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want a completely honest answer. After everything that's happened here today, would you actually want to work for us? The question caught everyone off guard, including Sarah. It was a remarkable reversal. The managing partner of a prestigious law firm essentially asking a job candidate whether they were worthy of her service. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that the traditional interview structure had collapsed entirely. Sarah considered the question carefully. She had walked into this building expecting another rejection, another moment of humiliation, where her memorial tattoos would be deemed inappropriate for corporate culture. Instead, she had found herself telling the story of Cerberus and her fallen platoon to people who had actually listened, who had shown genuine emotion, and who seemed to be grappling with the implications of their own biases. "I think," Sarah said slowly, "that depends on what you do next. What I've experienced here today could be the beginning of real change, or it could be a momentary emotional response that fades once the reality of implementation sets in." Dr. Elizabeth Warren nodded appreciatively. "What would real change look like to you?" Sarah moved to the window, looking out at the sprawling city below. Phoenix was full of veterans. Arizona had one of the largest veteran populations in the country. Many of them were struggling with employment, discrimination, and the challenge of translating their military skills into civilian success. Her case was just one example of a much larger systemic problem. Real change would mean examining every policy, every assumption, every standard practice through the lens of inclusion rather than exclusion, Sarah said. It would mean understanding that diversity isn't just about demographics. It's about experience, perspective, and the different kinds of strength that people bring to an organization. James Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had been silent for most of the past hour, clearly struggling with the realization that his assumptions about military tattoos had been not just wrong, but harmful. "What about our other partners, our clients? This isn't just our decision to make." Sarah turned back to face the group. That's exactly the kind of thinking that perpetuates discrimination. What will others think becomes more important than doing what's right. Leadership means being willing to educate others, to set standards rather than follow them. Patricia Henderson found herself nodding. Sarah was right, of course. True leadership required the courage to challenge existing norms, even when it was uncomfortable. But the practical implications were daunting. Changing firm culture, educating partners and staff, potentially losing clients who held outdated views. It all seemed overwhelming. "Let me tell you what happened at the last firm that offered me a position," Sarah continued. "They were excited about my qualifications, my military background, my experience with veterans law. But they wanted me to wear long sleeves year-round, to keep my memorial tattoos covered, so they wouldn't distract from my legal arguments." The silence that followed was uncomfortable but necessary. I told them that asking me to hide my memorials was like asking me to hide my identity, my service, my brothers who died for this country. They said they understood but maintained that it was just business, nothing personal. I walked away. Dr. Warren leaned forward. "What would you have done if they had said yes? If they had been willing to accept your tattoos openly?" "I would have worked harder for them than any employee they'd ever had," Sarah replied without hesitation. "When an organization shows respect for your service, for your identity, for the things that matter most to you, that generates loyalty that money can't buy." The partners exchanged glances, each processing the implications differently. They were being offered something more valuable than just a qualified attorney. They were being offered the opportunity to demonstrate genuine support for veterans, to be leaders rather than followers in the area of military inclusion. Patricia Henderson made a decision that would redefine her firm's future. "Sarah, I want to make you an offer right now, today. Not just for the position we advertised, but for something bigger. I want you to join us as a partner-track attorney with the specific mandate to develop our veterans law practice. Full salary, full benefits, full support. And the explicit understanding that your memorial tattoos are not just acceptable but honored." The offer hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah had expected many things from this interview, but not a partnership-track position with the explicit endorsement of her memorial tattoos. "There's more," Patricia continued. "I want you to help us develop policies that ensure other veterans won't face the discrimination you've experienced. I want Henderson and Associates to become the kind of firm that other veterans know they can approach without fear of judgment." Sarah felt a stirring of something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not just for herself, but for the countless other veterans who carried their service proudly, but found themselves shut out of professional opportunities because of visible reminders of their sacrifice. "What about your other partners?" Sarah asked.
Your clients?
"The practical challenges you mentioned?" Dr. Warren spoke up. "I've been hiding my memorial tattoo for 3 years because I was afraid of judgment. If we're serious about this change, it starts with us. I'm willing to reveal my memorial to Michael if it helps other veterans feel accepted." James Morrison, who had been the most skeptical, surprised everyone with his response. "I don't have military service and I don't have tattoos. But I do have a conscience, and I can see that our policies have been wrong. If we're going to change, we need to do it completely, not halfway." The other partners nodded in agreement. What had begun as an interview had become a moment of institutional transformation. They were committing not just to hiring Sarah, but to examining and changing their fundamental approach to veterans' employment. "There's something else you should know," Sarah said. "The veteran community talks. Word spreads quickly about which employers are genuinely supportive and which ones just pay lip service to veterans' issues. If you do this right, if you create a truly inclusive environment, you'll attract some of the best legal talent in the country. Veterans are incredibly loyal to employers who respect their service." Patricia Henderson smiled for the first time since the interview began. "Are you saying we're making a good business decision as well as the right moral decision?" "I'm saying that doing the right thing often turns out to be good business," Sarah replied. "Veterans bring unique perspectives on leadership, crisis management, cultural competency, and client service. You'll be surprised by how much your firm benefits from truly embracing military diversity." The conversation continued for another hour, covering practical details, implementation strategies, and timeline considerations. But the fundamental decision had been made. Henderson and Associates would not just offer Sarah a position, they would transform themselves into the kind of organization that honored service rather than hiding from it. As the meeting concluded, Sarah rolled down her sleeves, not to hide her memorial tattoos, but simply because the formal interview portion was over. The Cerberus tattoo, with its 3 guardian heads watching over the names of the fallen, disappeared beneath fabric, but its impact on the room would be lasting. 6 months later, Henderson and Associates had become known throughout Arizona as the premier law firm for veterans' legal issues. Sarah Martinez had successfully argued 3 major discrimination cases, bringing settlements that changed policy at several major corporations. Dr. Warren had revealed her memorial tattoo to Michael, inspiring other staff members to share their own stories of military connection. But perhaps most importantly, the firm had created a model for how civilian organizations could genuinely honor military service, rather than just claiming to support it. They had learned that true support meant accepting veterans as they were, memorials and all, rather than asking them to hide the very experiences that had shaped their character and capabilities. The Cerberus tattoo continued to watch over the fallen, but now it also served as a symbol of victory, proof that sometimes demanding respect for service and sacrifice could actually change hearts, minds, and institutional culture. Sarah Martinez had walked into that conference room, carrying the memory of 23 fallen comrades, and she had walked out with the promise that their sacrifice would be honored in ways they never could have imagined.